She didn't even say hello, just pointed at my shutters. Not HOA compliant. Repaint them in 48 hours. The woman with the clipboard stood on my front porch like she owned the place, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing toward the deep blue shutters I'd spent 3 weekends painting. Behind her, a black sedan idled in my driveway, engine running as if she couldn't waste a second more than necessary in my presence. I'd lived in Oakwood Manor for 6 months. 6 peaceful months of morning coffee on the porch, weekend barbecues, and neighbors who actually waved when they passed. Until today. Until her. The woman everyone whispered about, but no one dared to confront. Margaret Thornfield, HOA president, neighborhood enforcer, and apparently, the person who decided what color my own house could be. 48 hours, she repeated, not waiting for my response. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd never been told no. Navy blue shutters violate Section 4.3 of the Community Guidelines. Approved colors are forest green, burgundy, or black. No exceptions. She clicked her pen twice, made a note on her clipboard, and turned toward her car without another word. Standing there in my bathrobe, coffee mug still warm in my hands, I watched her drive away. The neighbors who'd been pretending to water their plants quickly disappeared inside. Mrs. Chun from next door gave me a sympathetic look before closing her curtains. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just met someone who'd forgotten what it meant to be human. What I didn't know was that Margaret Thornfield had a reason for her rules. A reason that would change everything I thought I knew about the woman with the clipboard. Welcome to Heartland Tales, where we explore the moments that reveal who we really are beneath the surface. Before we continue with Margaret's story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe that every person carries a story worth understanding, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this journey. Oakwood Manor wasn't just any subdivision. It was the kind of place where house numbers were engraved in brass, where mailboxes matched the architectural style of each home, and where the grass was always exactly 2.5 inches tall. Every morning at precisely 7 a.m., sprinkler systems activated in perfect synchronization across 127 properties. Every evening at sunset, decorative street lamps flickered on, casting warm light across sidewalks that never showed a single crack. The community had been Margaret's vision from the beginning. 10 years ago, she'd moved here when it was nothing but empty lots and construction crews. She'd been the first to buy, the first to move in, and the first to propose the homeowners association that would maintain the standards she believed were necessary. Not just for property values, but for something deeper. Something about creating a place where chaos couldn't reach. Her daily routine never varied. Every morning at 8:30, she'd emerge from her colonial-style house carrying her leather clipboard and wearing one of her dozen navy blazers. She'd walk the curved streets methodically, checking each property against the thick manual she'd helped write. Garbage cans visible from the street after pickup day. Lawn decorations that exceeded the approved height limit. Paint colors that had faded beyond acceptable standards. She documented everything. The neighbors had learned to time their morning routines around hers. They'd watch from kitchen windows as she approached, quickly moving newspapers from driveways, adjusting welcome mats, or pulling weeds they'd missed. Some called her thorough, others called her obsessive, but everyone called her when they needed something done right. Because Margaret Thornfield, whatever else she was, got results. She lived alone in the largest house on Maple Street, a 2-story colonial with white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges that formed geometric patterns around her front yard. The house had 5 bedrooms, but only one was furnished. The others stood empty, their windows clean and curtains hung at regulation height, but void of the personal touches that made a house feel like home. Margaret had purchased the property not for its space, but for its position. From her second-floor office window, she could see 17 houses, 3 intersections, and the community playground where children gathered every afternoon after school. The office itself was a study in organization. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with categories like landscaping violations, architectural modifications, and resident communications. Her desk held 3 computer monitors, each displaying different camera feeds from around the neighborhood. Not security cameras, but the kind homeowners installed to watch their own properties. Margaret had convinced dozens of residents to share their feeds with her, claiming it was for community safety. And it was, though not in the way most people understood. The first violation notice arrived on a Wednesday. I found it tucked under my windshield wiper, typed on official HOA letterhead. Unauthorized garden gnome exceeds decorative item height restriction. Remove within 72 hours or face fine escalation. The gnome in question was 6 inches tall and had been a housewarming gift from my daughter. It sat next to my front steps, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I walked to Margaret's house that afternoon, hoping to explain. She answered the door in her blazer, clipboard in hand, as if she'd been expecting me. "Mr. Patterson," she said, checking something on her papers. "I assume you're here about the gnome violation." "It's just a small decoration," I said, trying to keep my voice friendly. "My daughter gave it to me. It's not hurting anyone." Margaret's expression didn't change. Section 7.2 clearly states that decorative items cannot exceed 4 inches in height without prior approval. The gnome measures 6 1/4 inches. It has to go, but it's practically hidden behind the bushes. You'd have to be looking for it to even notice. "Rules apply to everyone equally, Mr. Patterson. That's what makes them fair." She started to close the door, then paused. Selective enforcement would be discrimination. Over the next month, the violations multiplied. My newspaper stayed in the driveway 15 minutes too long. My car was parked 3 inches over the property line. The wreath on my door was hung with a nail instead of an approved adhesive hook. Each notice came with increasing fines. Each interaction with Margaret became more tense. Other neighbors began sharing their own stories. The Johnsons had been fined for planting roses without submitting a landscaping plan. The Patel family received a violation for their son's bicycle being visible from the street. Mrs. Rodriguez was cited for hanging laundry on a line instead of using her dryer. Everyone had a Margaret story, and none of them were pleasant. But something else was happening too. Despite the complaints, despite the frustration, people were starting to notice things. The neighborhood looked immaculate. Property values were rising. The streets were safe, clean, and peaceful. Children played on sidewalks without worrying about traffic or crime. Whatever Margaret was doing, however she was doing it, Oakwood Manor was becoming everything she'd promised it would be. The community meetings became legendary for their tension. Every third Thursday of the month, residents would gather in the clubhouse, and Margaret would present her monthly report. She'd stand at the podium with her charts and graphs, detailing violation statistics, maintenance schedules, and upcoming projects. Her presentations were thorough, professional, and completely devoid of warmth. "Property values have increased 12% this quarter," she announced at one meeting, clicking through slides on her laptop. "Street maintenance is ahead of schedule. Landscaping compliance is at 94%, up from 87% last month." She paused, scanning the room. "However, we still have issues with garbage can placement and unauthorized modifications." The questions that followed were always the same. Why couldn't children leave their bikes in the front yard? Why did every mailbox have to be identical? Why couldn't residents choose their own paint colors? Margaret's answers were always the same too. Standards, consistency, property values, the greater good. But after each meeting, people would linger in the parking lot, sharing their frustrations and wondering if anyone else was tired of living under Margaret's microscope. The complaints grew louder, the resistance stronger. A petition circulated calling for new HOA leadership. Online forums buzzed with criticism. Some residents openly talked about moving away. Margaret never responded to the criticism publicly. She continued her morning walks, continued documenting violations, continued enforcing rules with the same unwavering determination. If the growing hostility affected her, she didn't show it. She seemed to exist in a bubble of professional detachment, immune to the emotional temperature of the community she governed. What none of us realized was that Margaret's detachment wasn't cold indifference. It was protection. She'd learned long ago that caring too much about what people thought would make it impossible to do what needed to be done. And what needed to be done, in her mind, was creating a place where families could thrive, where children could grow up safely, where people could invest their lives without fear of chaos destroying what they'd built. The breaking point came during the annual block party planning meeting. Margaret had proposed a detailed schedule with assigned time slots for activities, designated areas for food stations, and a comprehensive cleanup protocol. The residents wanted something more relaxed, more spontaneous. The argument that followed was heated, personal, and ugly. "You're turning our neighborhood into a prison," shouted Tom Johnson, whose roses had been the subject of multiple violations. We moved here to live, not to be managed like inmates. Margaret's response was calm but firm. I'm maintaining the standards you all agreed to when you signed your contracts. If you want to live in chaos, there are plenty of other neighborhoods available. The room erupted. People stood up, voices raised, accusations flying. Margaret stood at the front, clipboard clutched to her chest, watching the community she'd built turn against her. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked vulnerable. Not defeated, but genuinely hurt by the anger surrounding her. The meeting ended with the block party being canceled. People filed out in angry clusters, muttering about forming a new HOA board, about finding ways to remove Margaret from power. She remained at the podium, organizing her papers with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else, but her hands were shaking slightly. I was one of the last to leave. As I passed the podium, I caught her eye. Margaret, maybe there's a way to compromise. To make the rules work for everyone. She looked at me for a long moment, then shook her head. Mr. Patterson, compromise is how good neighborhoods become bad ones. I've seen it happen before. I won't let it happen here. The emergency happened on a Tuesday morning. I was getting ready for work when I heard the screaming. Mrs. Chun from next door was standing in her yard, pointing at her house and shouting words I couldn't understand. Smoke was pouring from her kitchen window, and I could see flames starting to lick at the curtains inside. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but before I could dial, I heard an engine racing down the street. Margaret's black sedan screeched to a stop in Mrs. Chin's driveway. She jumped out, not in her usual blazer but in a nightgown and slippers, her gray hair uncombed and her clipboard nowhere to be seen. Where's your husband? She shouted to Mrs. Chun, who was still standing frozen in the yard. Where's David? Inside, Mrs. Chun sobbed. He's still inside. I can't find him. Without hesitation, Margaret ran toward the house. Not walked, not approached carefully, but ran straight toward the flames. Mrs. Chun grabbed her arm, trying to stop her, but Margaret pulled free and disappeared through the front door into the smoke. The fire department arrived 6 minutes later. 6 minutes that felt like an hour as neighbors gathered in the street, watching smoke pour from the Chun house and waiting for any sign of movement inside. When the first firefighter emerged, he was helping David Chun walk to the ambulance. Behind him came Margaret, her nightgown singed, her face covered in soot, but her arms supporting Mrs. Chin's elderly mother who had been trapped in the back bedroom. As the paramedics checked everyone for smoke inhalation, I approached Margaret. She was sitting on the curb, staring at the damaged house with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the controlled authority she usually wore, but something raw and vulnerable. How did you know to come here? I asked. She looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, Margaret's voice was quiet. I saw the smoke from my bedroom window. I've been watching this street for 10 years. I know every house, every family, every routine. When something's wrong, I know. You could have been killed, I said. David Chun has diabetes. His wife doesn't speak much English. His mother-in-law is 93 and uses a walker. The fire department would have searched the master bedroom first, then the living room. They wouldn't have known about the converted bedroom in the back where she stays. She paused, wiping soot from her face. I know because I've been inside every house in this neighborhood. I know because I pay attention to details that matter. That's when I understood. The clipboard, the rules, the constant vigilance weren't about control. They were about caring. Margaret Thornfield wasn't policing our neighborhood because she enjoyed authority. She was protecting it because she loved it. And she loved it because, for the first time in her life, she'd found a place where she could make a difference. But there was more to the story. As the crowd began to disperse and the fire trucks prepared to leave, Margaret remained on the curb, now wrapped in a blanket someone had brought her. The adrenaline was wearing off, and something else was emerging. Something that explained not just her heroism, but her entire approach to neighborhood management. My daughter would have been 32 this year, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I sat down beside her, sensing this was something she needed to say. She died in a house fire when she was 7. I was at work, staying late to finish a project. She was home with a babysitter who fell asleep on the couch. The space heater in Emma's bedroom overheated. The smoke detector had a dead battery. She stared at the Chun house, where firefighters were now checking for hot spots. The fire department got there in time. The house was savable. But Emma's room was in the back, and they didn't know she was there. By the time they found her, it was too late. 3 more minutes, maybe 4, and she would have lived. The weight of her words settled over me. Everything began to make sense. The obsessive attention to detail, the insistence on following every rule, the way she seemed to know every resident's habits and routines. Margaret wasn't just managing a neighborhood. She was trying to prevent another tragedy like the one that had destroyed her family. I moved here to start over, she continued. To build something safe. Every violation I write, every rule I enforce, it's because I've seen what happens when people get careless. When they assume everything will be fine. When they think the rules don't apply to them. Her monitoring of the security cameras, her knowledge of every resident's schedule, her insistence on maintaining every safety standard. It all stemmed from a mother's grief and a promise she'd made to a daughter who would never grow up. Margaret hadn't been trying to control people's lives. She'd been trying to save them. The morning after the fire, word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Mrs. Chin's family was staying with relatives while their house was being repaired. The insurance adjuster confirmed that Margaret's quick action had saved not just David and his mother-in-law, but potentially prevented the fire from spreading to other houses. If she hadn't acted when she did, if she hadn't known the layout of the house and the routines of its residents, the story would have ended very differently. But it wasn't just her knowledge that impressed people. It was her willingness to risk everything. The woman who had seemed so cold, so distant, so concerned with trivial rules, had literally run into a burning building to save her neighbors. She'd done it without hesitation, without thought for her own safety, without any expectation of recognition or reward. People began to see her differently. The morning walks that had seemed like surveillance now looked like devotion. The detailed knowledge of every resident's habits that had felt invasive now seemed protective. The strict enforcement of safety regulations that had annoyed everyone now made perfect sense. Tom Johnson, who had been one of Margaret's harshest critics, showed up at her door the next morning with a box of pastries and an apology. "I didn't understand," he said simply. "I thought you were just being controlling. I didn't realize you were trying to protect us." Margaret accepted his apology with the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout the controversy. She didn't use her heroism as vindication or demand recognition for her years of service. She simply continued doing what she'd always done, but now people understood why she did it. The next morning, I found Margaret in her usual spot, clipboard in hand, walking her route. But something was different. As she approached each house, neighbors came outside to greet her. The Johnsons offered her coffee. The Patel family invited her to see their son's science project. Mrs. Rodriguez gave her a homemade tamale and a hug that lasted longer than any official business required. I waited for her on my front porch, holding a cup of coffee and watching as she methodically checked each property. When she reached my house, she paused at the garden gnome that was still sitting by my front steps. "Mr. Patterson," she said, consulting her clipboard. "I see the decorative item is still present." "Yes, ma'am. It is." She looked at the gnome, then at me, then back at her clipboard. With her pen, she made a note and showed it to me. "Approved by special variance. Grandfather clause for items with sentimental value. No fine assessed." "Thank you, Margaret." She nodded once, then started to walk away. But she stopped and turned back. "Your daughter has good taste in garden decorations. Tell her I said so." The changes in the neighborhood were subtle but significant. The HOA meetings became collaborative rather than confrontational. Residents still followed the rules, but now they understood the purpose behind them. Margaret still enforced standards, but she also began explaining why certain regulations existed. She started sharing safety tips, organizing emergency preparedness workshops, and creating a neighborhood watch program that went far beyond checking for paint violations. The community that had once seen her as a tyrant now recognized her as a guardian. The woman who had seemed heartless revealed herself to be someone whose heart had been broken by loss and reformed by purpose. She'd turned her grief into service, her pain into protection, her personal tragedy into a mission to prevent others from experiencing what she'd endured. Over the following weeks, the violations decreased, but the standards remained high. Margaret still walked her route every morning, still carried her clipboard, still enforced the rules that kept our neighborhood beautiful. But now she also knew which houses had elderly residents who might need help, which families had young children who might be playing in the street, and which neighbors might be struggling with problems they couldn't solve alone. The woman with the clipboard hadn't changed, but our understanding of her had. Margaret Thornfield wasn't the neighborhood tyrant we'd imagined. She was its guardian, its protector, its most dedicated resident. She was someone who understood that home isn't just a building with approved paint colors and regulation height lawn decorations. Home is a place where someone cares enough to pay attention, to show up, to risk everything when it matters most. The transformation wasn't just in how we saw Margaret, but in how we saw ourselves as a community. We began to understand that the rules weren't arbitrary restrictions, but carefully crafted protections. The standards weren't about conformity, but about creating an environment where families could flourish. The vigilance wasn't about control, but about caring for each other in ways that went beyond casual friendliness. Margaret's story became a reminder that heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it shows up in the daily, mundane work of caring for others. Sometimes it looks like the neighbor who pays attention when everyone else is busy. Sometimes it wears a blazer and carries a clipboard and makes sure the smoke detectors are working and the fire hydrants are clear and the emergency access routes are properly maintained. In the months that followed, Oakwood Manor became something more than a well-maintained subdivision. It became a true community where people looked out for each other, where standards were maintained not out of fear but out of love, where the woman with the clipboard was no longer seen as an adversary, but as someone who had chosen to turn her deepest loss into everyone else's protection. Margaret never talked about her daughter again, at least not publicly. But sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would pause during her morning walks and look at the children playing in their yards or riding their bikes on the sidewalks she kept so meticulously clean. In those moments, her expression would soften, and you could see the mother she'd been, the loss she'd endured, and the promise she'd made to never let it happen again. Sometimes the person who seems most concerned with rules is actually the one who understands best what happens when those rules disappear. Sometimes the neighbor who appears to care only about property values is actually the one who values the people living in those properties more than anyone else realizes. And sometimes the woman with the clipboard who knocks on your door to complain about your shutters is the same woman who would run into a burning building to save your life. Margaret Thornfield never asked for recognition. She never explained her methods or defended her approach. She simply showed up every day, clipboard in hand, watching over a neighborhood that had become her life's work. She understood that love doesn't always look like kindness, that protection doesn't always feel comfortable, and that sometimes the most important job is the one that makes you unpopular with the very people you're trying to help. But when the smoke cleared and the danger passed, when the moment came that revealed who she really was beneath the blazer and the clipboard, Margaret Thornfield proved something we all need to remember. The person who seems to care most about the small things is often the person who understands best that small things matter because they protect the big things we can't afford to lose. Her legacy wasn't measured in violation notices or compliance statistics. It was measured in the lives she'd touched, the disasters she'd prevented, and the community she'd built through decades of quiet service. She'd shown us that sometimes the most profound love is expressed not in grand gestures, but in daily vigilance, not in popularity, but in protection, not in being liked, but in being necessary. The clipboard became a symbol not of bureaucratic control, but of dedication. The rules became not restrictions, but safeguards. The woman who had seemed so cold revealed herself to be someone whose heart burned with a fire that had never been extinguished, only redirected toward keeping other families safe, other children protected, other homes secure. This story was brought to you by Heartland Tales. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who watched over you or your community in ways you didn't appreciate until it was almost too late? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their protection shaped your life. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.